Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is a writer for Field and Stream and author of the recently released book of poetry, Echolocation, Sage Marshall. Thanks for being on here.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So, because I'm a high school English teacher, I got to start with an English question. Would your senior English teacher have said, "Yes, I believe that one day Sage will publish a book of poetry about the outdoors"? And is that a possibility? What do you think?
I like to think I like to think so, Jeff. My high school English teacher was actually one of the people that sort of really introduced me and pushed me into creative writing. I remember during high school, I sometimes didn't take English class so seriously. I remember in my junior year, my English professor was trying to push me into taking an AP English class and make taking more of an advanced level English class, and I sort of declined to do so and decided to take what was at the time considered like elective English classes at my school, and one of those was like a life writing, creative writing English class. And so my senior year English teacher was Mr. Reynolds, and I remember reading people like David Foster Wallace in his class. I believe he had a subscription of the New Yorker that he had us all read, and I really sort of for the first time in high school enjoyed my writing classes and started writing creative essays and sort of haven't stopped since then.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a huge thing. It's writing and reading. Once you find the genre that you prefer or the medium that you prefer, it makes such a huge difference. I wouldn't say indifferent to reading, but I kind of liked reading sports magazines, things like that. And I didn't mind writing, but I didn't really like writing essays. And so the journalistic, nonfiction essay writing stuff was a lot more fun for me. And when I got into journalism in college, like that was I knew I'd found something that I'd do forever.
Yeah, totally.
So what was your journey? You graduate high school. Were you journalism major or would you get major wise?
I had kind of a unique journey. I feel like most writers probably do, since it's not usually like a straightforward path. But after I graduated from high school, I actually played juniors hockey, so I was big into hockey. So I had a little bit of time off of school between high school and college. But I was kind of like, I don't know if your listeners will be familiar with juniors, but it's essentially like ice hockey level that's in between high school and college, and most of the players are 18, 19, and 20 and play in these small towns or cities in the US and Canada. And so I was this kind of funny juniors hockey player who would go to practice and then either go fishing or go to Barnes and Nobles and do some reading once the everything was frozen over. Um, but after that, yeah, I went to college in Connecticut and I majored in English. And at the time, I had actually also started freelance writing. I think I sold my first article when I was 19. It was to a little publication that's now defunct called Mountain Magazine in Colorado. And I wrote about a couple of backpacking trips for their website, not the magazine. But I thought it was like a coup that I had been able to go on these fun adventures, write about them, and then actually get paid. And so once I started doing that, I didn't stop. So I studied English. I never really focused on journalism at the university level. I went to a small liberal arts school, and we didn't have a journalism track. So it was something that I was sort of doing on the side and using the reading and critical thinking skills that I gained through the English major.
Mhm. As far as influences, who were you reading? I know Bill Heavey was huge for me when I started reading about the outdoors, and his back page column in Field and Stream was just so influential because it showed that if Field and Stream is going to commit the back page column to someone who is obviously proficient, but focused on the reality that not everybody is an expert with the body count or with trout slams or with sheep slams or anything. It was just so, it was exceptional writing about the ordinary everyday man. I just loved reading his stuff so much. So he was big influence for me. Who were some of your influential
Yeah,
people?
it's funny you mentioned Bill Heavey because I wrote down a couple of notes for this interview, and one of the first names I have down here is Bill Heavey, and I certainly do also consider him an influence, sort of for being the everyday outdoorsman and being such a funny writer. And I don't actually consider myself to be a funny writer, so in that way, I will never be like Bill Heavey, but. Um, I was always so impressed with his range. Like he would have these funny stories and then he would get into serious, sort of like emotional discussions. I don't know if you've ever read Lilyfish or
I share it with my students every year.
yeah, yeah, so like an essay like that is just you couldn't write a more serious or sad essay than that. So his range is extraordinary. Um, but yeah, I'm certainly inspired by a lot of the classic Field and Stream guys that I read growing up, like Eddie Nickens or Hal Herring. And then in terms of more general outdoors writers, I'm inspired by folks like Ed Abbey, Tom McGuane, and Hemingway.
Mhm. Yeah, something about reading those people. It's not that you necessarily emulate them or want to, you know, be influenced in your writing necessarily, but just that authenticity that they have or their own style. So I could never write like that, like you said with Heavey, but
Mhm.
just someone who's good at that type of writing kind of inspires you to find your own voice. Did you find that to be the case?
I'm just gonna take a second to think about this. Yes, I do think that when writers are able to like successfully articulate a specific style or express a unique voice, that is inspiring also for myself as a writer because it means like you don't have to write like everybody else to be successful. You can write like yourself, and it might be a bit different, but there's room for that.
Yeah, that's great stuff. So you're when did you start thinking about writing a book or put together a compilation of poetry, and how long did it take you to get your book finished?
Yeah, so my book Echolocation, which just came out, was quite a few years in the works. As I was early on in college, I actually hadn't been writing poetry for quite a while. I enjoyed doing it as like a middle schooler and then got away from it through high school and the beginning of college. It always felt like a really intangible form to me, compared to essay writing and journalism, which I felt like, okay, I had a pretty good grasp on what was good and what was interesting, whereas poetry felt really hard to know. And but then I got some encouragement from a couple of different professors during college, when I took like a one-off poetry lecture, things like this. They gave me some good encouragement, and I thought, hey, maybe I could actually write poetry. And so I wrote most of this book in like the 4 or 5 years after I graduated from undergrad. And in that time, during much of the time, I was working full time at Field and Stream. And at the time, I was doing a lot of clickbait news stories, multiple news stories every day, record fish, record bucks, just, animal attacks, animals fighting each other. I was the news guy at Field and Stream, and I was doing a ton of writing and a ton of time on my computer, but a lot of the work that I was doing wasn't necessarily creative, and I didn't have a lot of headspace really to put towards extended creative projects outside of work. Except I found that I could write poems, short poems, and that was something that I could do with my otherwise pretty demanding workload. And so I wrote that book during those years. As I was working at Film Stream, I was also learning how to hunt. So this book reckons with learning how to hunt. It reckons with different fishing experiences and all those outdoor experiences were sort of like a lens into to kind of trying to understand myself as a young man.
It's super interesting. I didn't start hunting until I was in my 30s too. So growing up in Southeast Alaska, it makes me sound like a bad Alaskan that I didn't tag my first buck until I was in my 30s. But I grew up fishing and outdoors and just had a lot of fun outside. So when you do come into hunting a little bit later, you have to grapple with those questions in a way that you have a different like intellectual ability maybe when you're younger and you're mentored, you just do it because grandpa or uncle or dad explains it to you and they explain hopefully some ecology that goes along with it and making sure that you're responsible and here are the ethics and you don't necessarily question it, you just do it. I respect these people and that's how you learn. When you're older and you come into it, there's a lot more of those questions. And the answers are a little bit different. Talked with Katie Hill. I know that Katie Hill did a really nice interview with you in the Western. Give her a little plug there. And she and I talked about that a little bit too. So, or what are some of the main questions that you kind of had and you were dealing with as you were coming into hunting at a little bit later age?
I think that coming into hunting as an adult is sort of interesting because at least from my experience talking with people that learned how to do it when they were young, there was a certain sense of inevitability. Like this is what we do, and so there wasn't. I mean, people have many most people had a certain amount of choice in the matter, but it felt like the decision to get into it as an adult, particularly with all of the things that go into learning how to hunt, it's not an easy hobby to get into. You have to make a pretty concerted effort and put a lot of resources into it to learn how to hunt. So it felt like a very active decision, and then doing so, I was sort of fixated before I started doing it on the actual killing part or the death of the animal. I had read a ton of hunting literature because I was working at Film Stream and had worked there on and off for a couple years already. And so I was really familiar with hunting, but generally, I felt like either the killing part gets glossed over, or every person has their own sort of personal ethic or way of dealing with it. And I was unsure how I would deal with that myself. And I think eventually, as it turned out, it was not as hard or scary as maybe I had once thought, although it was often at times very emotional. And to be honest, I think that emotionality is one of the things that drew me to hunting because as adults, we don't always have recreational activities where we're engaging our emotions um, in the same range that we do through hunting, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, growing up fishing, it's a lot of fun. The, you hook the fish and there's that thrill.
Mhm.
When you fly fish and you're doing catch and release, you have the suspense beforehand. You drop the fly in there and you're just waiting, hoping something takes. Maybe you can see the open mouth coming to make the take, and then you have the fight. Whereas hunting, it's not at all. It's I guess similar in that there's a lot of suspense, but there is no like thrill of the fight. It should be over as quick as possible, and then there's a ton of work. You don't have that simple release and it's gone. There's that feeling of this is a pretty big thing that's just happened here, and I've been able to provide, and this is the reality that comes with if I'm going to eat meat, a death has to happen. And by taking responsibility, that's a tough thing for people to do. I know some people who aren't against hunting, just don't do it themselves, and they eat meat. It's just not something that they're willing to do, and it doesn't make them wrong, bad, hypocritical, anything. It's a pretty heavy thing.
Yeah, and I will say, I'm primarily a bird hunter. So for me, I don't know, for whatever reason, I was attracted more towards bird hunting. I've done some big game hunting and I've killed a deer before, but it feels like the stakes are of course still very high with bird hunting, but it feels like as a new hunter, it didn't feel like quite as overwhelming to process a duck versus like
Mhm.
trying to break down a deer.
Yeah. What do you prefer more? Do you like fishing and hunting? They're very, very different, but if you could only do one for an entire year, what would you choose?
Ah, that's a really tough question. My two favorites really are fly fishing and duck hunting. And I guess I would have to go, right now I would have to go with duck hunting because it still feels like there's a lot of novelty to it, whereas fishing is something I've had a longer relationship to. And I also have I have a new hunting dog that I've owned for almost a year, and he'd be pretty pissed if we couldn't go hunting for a whole year.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. What do you shoot shotgun wise?
I'm a pretty basic shotgun shooter. When I first got into duck hunting, I didn't want to make a like a huge purchase because again, I was sort of dipping my toes into it and trying different types of hunting and seeing what appealed to me. So I've got a Mossberg 500 that I use on the marsh, and it's never failed me. It's just like a tried and true pump action shotgun. And then this year I started using a CZ ultralight when I'm in the uplands.
I have a Remington 870 Express, just that standard basic. It just works, and that was when I do duck hunting up here. It's just nice to have that one. It's trusty. I don't really know the difference between that and the performance of more expensive shotgun. Around here it's so wet, and then you're going to be doing a lot of hunting in the saltwater area, and so some of those expensive guns you'd really want to take care of them. Uh, Otherwise, there could be some damage. But yeah, like I said, there's nothing. I don't really know the difference. I don't know what I would be getting, and that was similar to when I started out fly fishing. You start off with that $60 kit, and the fly rod just casts horribly. It's not responsive, and you need rotator cuff surgery after a couple hours. But you start to learn your casting style and a rod that kind of fits it. So, as far as fly fishing goes, what do you like to fish with?
I have probably too many fly fishing rods than I need, and it's kind of a
Impossible.
contrast to
Impossible.
my to my um only having one or two shotguns. I've got like 8 or 10 fly rods, and I can't get rid of any of them. But I started fly fishing with like you said, like with kind of a basic 5 weight trout rod. I grew up in Colorado and started fishing on the rivers and streams in southwest Colorado. And so most of it was pretty small water. Um, so at the time, the 5 weight was also almost overpowered for a lot of the water there. But I started with an Orvis clear water setup, and I still have it, and I still use it. It's really hard to beat an Orvis clear water. Um, and then, as the years have gone by, my array has grown a lot. For those small mountain creeks, I have a Redington butter stick, which is actually kind of a funky new fiberglass rod that's really slow action. And so when I'm fishing those small creeks, it's a really fun rod to use. I guess my daily driver fly rod right now is a Hardy Ultralight X, um, which is just a gorgeous rod, and um, it can do everything that you want out of a 5 weight.
Mhm. Couple years ago, I think it was a couple years ago, at some point, Field and Stream did their rod testing, and you were part of that. Can you go into a little bit about how Field and Stream sets up those rod tests? Because there's a lot of reviews online that just reek of some sort of celebrity endorsement. So you have this figurehead who's saying, these are the best trekking poles, or this is the best rod, or this is what I use. And you think, well, of course you're going to use that because they're giving you money to say that. So, how does Field and Stream set up those? How do they get those rods? And then how did you, um, I guess, enjoy the experience of being able to cast all those rods?
Sure. So a lot of the time with Field and Stream, the gear tests are sort of done by just one writer who calls in a bunch of products and does it. But for like our really serious product tests, our most important products, if you're thinking about like duck shotguns or fly fishing rods, we'll actually bring a group of writers together. And in this case in particular, a bunch of the Field and Stream team uh, are avid fly anglers. And so we use this fly rod test as a chance to get together and connect in person. Because the Field and Stream team is even the editors are remote, and then freelancers like myself are remote as well. So we have writers and editors all over the place. So being able to come together and do a fly rod test together is really neat, and we put a lot of effort into the fly rod test because it was near and dear to our hearts. So we met on the Delaware River in New York, and it was actually my first time fishing. One of those classic fly fishing streams on the East Coast. And we fished a sulfur hatch in June. So it was really small flies. It was 6X. It was way more technical fishing than I was used to coming from the West. So, we spent a couple of days fishing, just kind of cycling all the rods together, cycling all the rods through all five of us. We put the same line on every single rod. So we try to limit as many variables as possible, the same reels, the same line. And we also spent a bunch of time just practicing casting in the field. We set up targets, we saw how far we could cast, how accurately we could cast. We did some of that lawn work blind, so like not necessarily knowing which rods we were throwing. And we each filled out pretty in depth. I mean, we had these big binders that we brought with us for the whole weekend, taking notes, comparing different aspects of the rods. And so I'm super proud that I had a hand in um, producing that gear test because I certainly haven't seen a fly rod test that's as comprehensive as that one that we did together. And I will just add that it was also a humbling experience because some of the older Field and Stream editors totally kicked my butt in terms of fly casting. So um, I feel like I could still give some good input in terms of fly rods, but it certainly brought to light some improvements that I needed to make in terms of fly casting.
Is there any insight or anything that kind of stuck out from that experience that you'd like to share? As far as like rod goes or skill or technique or anything? Technology?
I mean, I think that it was actually one of my first times using these $1,000 fly rods, and because otherwise, as a young 20 something fly angler, I always envied people that had those fly rods but never had the cash for it. And so it was my first time really using those rods in depth. And I think I found out that yes, they were really special. Oftentimes some of these rods, like the Sage R8, for instance, it felt like you could do anything, cast anywhere, and you just had to think and the rod would go there and the feel of the rod would be really good. Um, but at the same time, there was like a sort of middle tier rods that were, they weren't the lowest of the low in terms of prices, but there was this middle tier of rods that were not necessarily out of my budget that still performed really well and sometimes just as good as the $1,000 rods. So I think for me, that was one of the more important takeaways, which was like, yeah, these expensive rods, they're really good, but the fly rod companies today are also making some really good rods that are just not quite at that price point, but would do anything you'd want on the water.
So there's obviously a place for, you mentioned that you'd done some writing with some of those, the news, clickbaity sort of things. There's a place for it. It's super interesting. And then there's comprehensive reviews, and there's also good storytelling. If you go forward 5, 10 years, where do you think the outdoor content industry is going to go? Do you think there's going to be a correction maybe back to valuing more that creative, good essay writing, or do you think we're just going to get clickbaiting forever?
Well, I'm certainly biased because I prefer reading the long articles. That's one of the reasons I wanted to be a writer and to write for magazines. I think that in recent years you've seen a print revival of some niche outdoor publications. So whether it is Field and Stream, which I'm lucky to write for, or a couple other ones like Adventure Journal, or in the more general outdoor space, there's some niche print publications coming back. So that seems like a good sign to me. Time will tell whether or not people will be willing to pay for it. And I hear a lot of people saying they want that in-depth storytelling, but we're also really used to getting free articles on the internet every day. So, it remains to be seen if people will consistently put their money where their mouth is. But if they do, I do think that these niche print publications and good old-fashioned books will survive. I mean, I hope they do because if they can survive any type of lifestyle, like it must be the hunting or fishing lifestyle that would be that, those people are we're inherently willing, we inherently place value on being outside and being away from our screens and telling stories over a campfire. So if there's any group of people that can keep good storytelling alive, my hope is that it's us.
Yeah, very well put. Very well put. I think there's something about that connection to the previous generation and the old timers talked about. Like we've kind of lost that connection, but there's a residual element that remains, and to keep that alive is so important in that connection. And while there is plenty of content out there that's just about the body count type, and all that. There's a lot more of that reverence, and it's still there, and there's a place for that. And it is nice that with a lot of independent journalism websites, those traditional gatekeepers, people can really write what they want and get it out there. And so it's not just kind of in a notebook somewhere on a laptop somewhere. So it's nice that that's out there. It's be interesting to see if it does congeal in more of those independent sort of publications, or um, with no limit on space, some of those other organizations can publish more content. When you look at, I got Field and Stream and Outdoor Life, and I would look forward to certain articles, but a lot of it wasn't really relevant because, we don't have whitetails up here, or, crappie fishing. I kind of irrelevant. But now with the websites, you can have the full gamut, and you don't have to worry about fitting it all into space that's paid for by advertising. So I think it's pretty exciting going forward. I think it's going to be enough of each, including the full form storytelling. So what about your most recent article about Gila trout? What tell me about that one?
Yeah, so over the summer, really fortunate to be able to travel down to the Gila Wilderness, which is in southern New Mexico, and fish for Gila trout, which are one of the rarest and most imperiled species of native trout that we have here in North America. The theme for the most recent issue of Field and Stream is wilderness, and as I was brainstorming what I might be able to contribute to the publication, I looked into what the first wilderness area in the United States is, and that's the Gila Wilderness, which was designated at the behest of Aldo Leopold before any other designated wilderness in the US. And that designation, sort of partly intentionally, I mean, Leopold was really concerned with having places without roads for hunters and anglers to access, but it also preserved really important Gila trout streams that otherwise could have been degraded through development, or at the time, fisheries managers were dumping a bunch of non-native trout into every body of water that they could. And so by keeping a lot of the Gila wilderness sort of off limits, it preserved Gila trout just mainly in these small, high alpine streams in an otherwise very arid part of the country. And for a while, like restoration efforts for the fish were going really well. And then, sort of in the 2010s, it in some ways took a nosedive because these mega fires started ravaging the region and killing off huge, like, I mean, they're actually pretty small stream systems, but there's not that many stream systems with native Gila trout in them. And so killing off the populations in different streams largely because of the ash flowing through them. So that really put the recovery efforts back, and put the species back to like a really threatened state. But at the same time, it did kill off some non-native populations and allow for different recovery efforts to begin. So this summer I went there, talked to a bunch of different scientists that were involved in restoration efforts, both in the past. Talked with Jim Brooks, who's like an old school biologist, mule packer, and then folks like Eileen Henry, who are sort of the next generation of conservationists in the Gila wilderness. And I also got to fish for them.
Nice. How did that feel to catch one of those trout, knowing like once you know the story of something, there's a whole different level of, I guess, intensity to the feeling, I would think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There are only like I think there are only three streams where you're allowed to fish for them in New Mexico. The fish are still on the endangered species list as a threatened species. So you can actually only fish for them in places where they've been recently restored. So essentially streams where they've been stocked in the last couple of years with the hopes that they're going to start reproducing on their own. Um, and to be able to fish those streams, I felt really grateful because you're essentially benefiting from years of work, lifetimes of work from biologists in the area, and also millions of dollars that have gone into the restoration efforts to be able to catch these really beautiful little trout that are not so unlike cutthroat trout, except that their coloring is different. Um, but yeah, I certainly valued every fish that I brought to hand in a way that I wouldn't have if they were, say, rainbow trout. Like, it was not lost on me that hardly anyone gets to fish for these, and it's not a given that people will be able to fish for these in the future.
Mhm. In closing here, can you give me a pitch for the book? Where can people get it? Why should someone get it? And all that good stuff.
Yeah, so Echolocation is out with Middle Creek Publishing. It's a echo-centric publisher. They focus primarily on poetry books, and the my book Echolocation I think would really appeal to hunters and anglers. Throughout the collection, I use the natural world as a way to sort of try to understand myself and those around me. So there's something in there for everyone, whether you're a fly angler, pheasant hunter, duck hunter. We've got poems that invoke those activities while also trying to get a deeper understanding of human nature and of ourselves. And primarily, I think it's also a bit of a coming of age poetry collection in which I'm sort of grappling with different aspects of violence that I've experienced growing up as a young man in the US. And also, if you are a fan of the American West and the different landscapes, the different wild places where eh, I'm going to rephrase the last sentence. Um, it's also a good collection because it invokes the American West's many different landscapes, which I have called home and explored throughout my adulthood. And the beauty of those places really comes through in the collection. You can buy the collection on Middle Creek Publishing's website. You could also purchase it on Amazon. Most local bookstores will not necessarily be carrying it, but you could ask your local bookstore to order a copy from the publisher, and I'm sure they'd be happy to do that. And you can also purchase a signed copy directly from me on my website, which is www.sagemarshall.com.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate you taking some time out of the day to be on here. Got some newborn diaper duties, so I'll go to that. And thanks again. Really appreciate it. And I have ordered your book, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Have a good one.
You too.